Imagine being told that the most powerful man in Europe wasn't a king or an emperor, but a banker named Jakob Fugger. Translate his fortune into today's money, and you land around $400 billion. Yet his clout was never just the size of his vaults. Fugger could tighten or loosen the finances of princes, push emperors toward decisions, and coax popes to revisit old rules. At his peak, he was, in effect, an uncrowned ruler, shaping policy wherever it intersected with his business. He sped up the rise of capitalism and modern finance, but he also helped sow divisions that would erupt into one of Europe's longest, bloodiest wars. How did a weaver's grandson become the man who could write stern reminders to the greatest monarchs of his age? This is the story of Jakob Fugger. To understand him, start with the climb. His grandfather Hans began as a peasant weaver in the village of Graben in Swabia. There was no noble bloodline, only patience, skill, and a willingness to move. Hans left the countryside for the free imperial city of Augsburg, where urban law and the guilds offered protections and pathways. He married into guild families, which brought civic rights, trading freedoms, and, eventually, a foothold on the city's councils. Cloth made their first money. Discipline kept it. Hans's most important gift to his descendants was not capital, but a playbook. Work hard, keep honest books, diversify, and marry wisely. His son Jakob Fugger pushed the method further. He avoided impulsive bets and spread risk across goods and routes, fustian and fine cloth, spices and gems, loans to solid borrowers, even the trade in holy relics that commanded princely prices. In 1463, he was admitted as a full member of the Merchants' Guild, a hard badge of status in a city where quality and reputation were currency. Jakob the Fries and his wife Barbara had 11 children, and with them a firm that functioned like a disciplined family partnership. The youngest of those children was Jakob VI. Ironically, he wasn't meant to run the firm at all. As a teenager, he leaned toward the church. In a slightly different history, he might have worn a cassock, even a bishop's ring. His brothers, convinced he had an instinct for numbers, pulled him into the business and shipped him to the finishing school of European finance, Venice. Venice in the 1470s was a university of money. In cramped rooms along the Rialto, young Jakob learned double-entry bookkeeping, the pricing of risk, the discounting of bills, and the mechanics of bills of exchange that turned far-flung promises into present cash. He saw how trust served as collateral and how partnerships were stitched together by letters and seals. He studied the ways merchants lawfully compensated for risk and delay under a church that still frowned on interest. In short, he learned to make time, distance, and uncertainty pay. Back in his 20s, he took over the Innsbruck branch and immediately broke the family mold. Fugger was brilliant, but unlike his cautious elders, he embraced calculated risk. Where they prized safety, he hunted leverage. He set his sights on Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol, a Habsburg lord notorious for extravagance and shaky books. Sigismund adored showy tournaments and parties that sounded like Fable's dwarfs springing from pies, gold scattered like confetti, and debts stacked like banners. Most bankers kept their distance. Fugger moved closer. He started with small, well-structured loans that proved reliability. Then came the opening. A conflict with Venice left the Archduke desperate. Big houses refused him. Their ledgers said his credit was spent. Fugger scraped together 100,000 florins, tens of millions today. The genius wasn't just the amount, it was the terms. He didn't want repayment measured in silver that could be diverted before it left the mine. He wanted control over revenues, over mints, over the mechanisms that made money move. Other bankers mocked the risk. Then the wagons arrived, train after train of schwas. Silver rolled into Fugger's warehouses. The gamble worked. He got paid, he gained leverage, and he earned the reputation of the man who could turn princely liabilities into engines of profit. Doors that had been bolted by noble privilege swung open. In Silesia, he partnered with engineers to survey veins and lease promising deposits. In Tyrol, he helped turn Schwaz into the largest mining metropolis of its age, a hive of shafts, pumps, ore stamps, and smelters. Copper from the Hungarian ore mountains and silver from Tyrol fed his furnaces. He integrated backward and forward at once, timber and charcoal contracts, ore carts and roads, smelting works and mints, counting houses and sales agencies. The business was no longer a series of deals. It was a system. copper mattered beyond coin. Cast into cannon and shot, it determined sieges and borders. Control the copper, and you could set the tempo of war. By coordinating production and marketing, the Fuggers approached monopoly. They could meter supply, steady prices, and starve rivals. To scale without losing control, Jakob turned family capital into corporate capital. In 1494, he organized a company with 54,000 guilders, and in 1496 he doubled the stake by bringing in the Prince Bishop of Brixen as a silent partner. He was assembling a copper monopoly and, with it, a continental power base. Power never stays quiet. When the Prince Bishop died, the papacy claimed his estate and with it a large share in the company. Capital froze in legal fog. Fugger didn't blink. He went to Rome, argued, negotiated, and leaned on friends in the Curia until the tangle loosened. The episode hammered home a rule that would guide him forever. Money without political influence is vulnerable. Political influence without money is impotent. He pivoted away from his first patron, Sigismund, and aligned with a stronger one, Maximilian of Habsburg. The bet paid. As Maximilian tightened his grip on Austria and the Empire, Fugger bankrolled Turning Point's logistics, troops, and, when politics collapsed into force, the seizure of Vienna. In return, privileges multiplied. The emperor opened Hungary's copper heartlands to him. There, Fugger rationalized leases, standardized ore purchasing, introduced performance incentives, and invested in transport so that metal could move year-round. In 1507, Maximilian rewarded him with the lordships of Kirchberg and Weissenhorn, pushing a merchant family into the circles of high nobility. With privilege came envy. Rival houses pressed Maximilian to clip Fugger's wings. Fugger pressed back, mobilizing bishops and dukes to remind the emperor how crucial his credit had become. In time, honors caught up with reality. Imperial recognition codified the status he already wielded in practice. Another test loomed: succession. Maximilian was aging, and the imperial title would be decided by the 7 electors. The contest was expensive and intense. Fugger understood both the stakes and the arithmetic. He raised a war chest and underwrote the campaign of Maximilian's grandson, Charles, already king in Spain. Of the vast sums needed to organize, persuade, and bind electoral commitments, Fugger supplied the decisive share. When Charles was proclaimed emperor in 1519, it was an open secret that the crown rested on Augsburg credit as much as Habsburg blood. Fugger never bet everything on one board. He hedged geopolitically, maintaining lines to other courts, Tudor England, the Valois in France, Italian princes whose mints and markets oiled Mediterranean trade. But his next grand arena was Rome. North to south, money flows, alms, tithes, and fees. Needed reliable carriers and clear accounts. Fugger secured the contracts to transfer German donations to the papal treasury and soon earned a nickname, God's Banker. He advanced pay to the Swiss Guard who protected the Pope and managed remittances from the sale of indulgences. From 1508 to 1515, the house even led the Roman mint. By now he held Europe's twin levers, the emperor's coffers and the Pope's purse. That finance underwrote monuments. Think of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and St. Peter's rising stone by stone. Fugger's credits, alongside those of other great houses, kept the projects alive when ordinary revenues ran thin. For a man without a title at birth, it was an extraordinary perch. He could and did say no to rulers unaccustomed to hearing it. In 1523, he sent Emperor Charles a pointed reminder to settle arrears. Without Fugger's money, there would have been no imperial crown. It wasn't bluster. The letter read like an audit note from Europe's most powerful private accountant to its most powerful sovereign. Innovations came not only from minds, but from law and ethics. Medieval theology condemned usury charging interest purely for time. Merchants to function needed honest, transparent ways to compensate for risk and delay. Through devices like bills of exchange, exchange fees, annuities, and time-price contracts, they did just that without calling it simple interest. Fugger was among the voices urging Rome to clarify gray areas so commerce could breathe. Slowly, authorities distinguished illicit usury from licit gain, and Europe's financial lungs expanded. His reach ran far beyond Central Europe. The Fuggers turned Antwerp into their northern hub, plugging into the world trade that funneled through the Scheldt. Copper hauled to Lisbon could be swapped for Portuguese spices, carried back to Antwerp, and dispersed across the continent. Bills settled in Lyon and Genoa. Insurance was placed in Venice. Silver and copper fed mints whose coins paid soldiers and taxes. The pattern was elegant: dig ore, smelt metal, mint coin, move goods, settle bills, repeat. Yet his most controversial legacy was one he never intended. The administration of indulgence revenues payments made for the remission of temporal penalties became a lightning rod. Critics saw the traffic in salvation as a scandal, proof that Rome had monetized grace and that a merchant had captured the church's conscience. In 1517, a monk in Saxony, Martin Luther, circulated 95 propositions against abuses tied to indulgences and to a wider economy of spiritual shortcuts. The pamphlet storm spread fast, and many of the angry lines the public drew ran straight through the figure of the banker. At the same time, preachers attacked the legalization of interest by another name, and moralists blamed new credit practices for trapping the poor. Ready loans helped merchants and cities expand, but predatory contracts caught peasants and artisans in cycles of arrears and forfeitures. Resentment focused on three poles of power: the Pope, the Emperor, and the banker, who seemed to stand behind both. Those resentments, fused to the ambitions of princes, helped destabilize Europe. The Reformation cracked religious unity. Rulers chose confessions along lines that were part belief and part interest. Tax revolts intertwined with dynastic rivalries. A century later, the tinder caught. The 30 Years' War plowed through Germany with a ferocity that emptied towns and turned fields to ash. Some regions lost around a fifth of their people, others far more. It would be wrong to blame a single financier for a cataclysm with many causes, but the systems Fugger helped build: monopolies in war metals, politicized credit, and the entanglement of pulpit and purse-supplied fuel to the blaze. So, who was the man behind the ledgers? Paradoxically, he lived simply. Fugger didn't chase luxury for its own sake. He chased outcomes. "I intend to gain while I can," he is said to have remarked, less a boast than a mission statement. He needed that focus to navigate the storms that came with scale: legal attacks by towns and princes, miners' strikes and accidents, attempts by Hungarian estates to nationalize operations, and uprisings in his own Augsburg backyard. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 shook the social fabric just as his body began to fail. He also used wealth to build institutions. In Augsburg, he founded the Fuggerei in 1521, a walled social housing quarter where needy townspeople still live for a token annual rent and a daily prayer. He endowed churches and hospitals and supported schools that trained notaries, bookkeepers, and artisans who served both city and firm. Philanthropy didn't erase controversy, but it rounded out the portrait: a capitalist titan who still thought in terms of community. By the early 1520s, the ground was shifting under his feet. The Reformation undercut the papal finance he had mastered and cast suspicion on every link in its chain, from indulgence preachers to the bankers who moved the funds. Free cities hedged between emperor and reform. Supply shocks, floods, and wars buffeted the mining districts. Fugger defended the old order and his position in it. The tide nevertheless was turning. He died in the winter of 1525 at 66. With no children of his own, he left the firm to his nephew Anton, along with a network of agencies stretching from Lisbon and Antwerp to Venice and Rome, contracts tying together mines, mints, and monarchies, and a reputation that would echo for centuries. What finally did Jakob Fugger change? If the Medici pioneered the architecture of Renaissance finance, Fugger industrialized it. He brought vertical integration to an imperial scale: mines, smelters, mints, credit, and courts binding the raw earth to the refined coin and then to the policy of kings. He showed that private capital could tilt the fate of crowns and conclaves. He helped force a theological reckoning with time and risk. And he proved, more than any contemporary, that in a Europe of many small states, a well-capitalized house could be a continental power. At the height of his influence, he could threaten the strongest sovereigns without raising a regiment. His letter to Charles was a reminder that the Habsburg mantle rested on credit as much as blood. His loans to Maximilian didn't just supply cash, They rewired maps, facilitating Habsburg claims in Hungary, and, in turn, protecting the very mines that fed his furnaces. His Antwerp network linked European metals to Atlantic spices, turning copper into pepper and pepper into profit. His agents used Lyon fairs to settle accounts, Genoa's bankers to clear transfers, and Venice to place insurance and intelligence. Information, not just metal, was his oxygen. Inside the firm, discipline was relentless. Branch ledgers were standardized so that an account in Venice could be reconciled seamlessly with one in Antwerp. Partners owed regular reports that matched cash, bills, and commodities. Agents were rotated to prevent cozy local interests from hijacking policy. Credit lines for princes were tied to collateral mines, tolls, taxes, or mints and capped unless new pledges were offered. If a borrower failed, Fugger preferred liens that produced cash flow over flashy but idle titles. That approach kept money moving. Rivals tried to break the chain. The Welsers in Augsburg challenged him for mining leases and colonial access. Italian houses courted the same sovereigns. Hanseatic traders fought to control Baltic copper flows. Fugger countered with longer leases, better logistics, closer ties to rulers, and a reputation for doing exactly what he promised. When he couldn't outbid, he outorganized. When he couldn't outorganize, he outweighted. Yet he could be implacable. When a debtor stalled, he sued. When a mine gang threatened sabotage, he replaced managers and fortified sites. When a town delayed a due, he withheld deliveries until accounts were squared. Letters from the house could sound cold, but the point was consistent. Credit is a promise with a date. That clarity made allies as well as enemies, because suppliers and soldiers trusted a house that settled on time. Behind all of this sat a private information network. Couriers ran between Augsburg, Innsbruck, Venice, Rome, Antwerp, Lyon, and Lisbon, carrying exchange rates, ship schedules, bullion tallies, and court gossip. From their packets grew the famous Fugger newsletters, early, regular summaries of political and commercial news. In a world before newspapers, credible intelligence was a tradable asset. It let him arrive at fairs with the right prices and leave before trouble. Let's zoom into the Hungarian copper story, because it shows how Fugger scaled. In the 1490s, he struck a partnership with the mining magnate János Thurzó, combining Augsburg capital with Upper Hungarian expertise. The joint enterprise, later nicknamed the Hungarian Trade, locked up leases across New Seoul and the surrounding districts. It improved drainage with new water-driven pumps, standardized pay and safety rules, and refined ore with the Sager process that separated silver from base metal. Output surged. From there, the metal traveled by cart and raft to depots on the Danube, over Alpine passes to South German mints, and onward to Antwerp. Strategic control of transport mattered as much as control of rock. By owning the steps between the vein and the vault, the house captured value others had to cede. The logistics web plugged into a broader commercial map. In Antwerp, brokers cleared copper against pepper, arriving from Lisbon's Carreira de India. Copper paid for spices, spices paid for coin, coin paid for soldiers and taxes, taxes guaranteed new concessions. These loops, repeated steadily, turned natural resources into durable political leverage. Because bills of exchange settled net balances at the great fairs of Lyon and in Genoa's banks, the firm could finance movement without shipping chest after chest of coin, a safer, smarter way to do business in an age of brigands and storms. Even the style of management mattered. Fugger insisted on precise audits and on rotating agents so that local ties never grew strong enough to override company policy. He wrote instructions that read like early risk manuals: lend against streams of revenue, not vague promises. Prefer collateral that throws off cash. Limit exposure to any one borrower. Keep reserves in forms that can move quickly. Where collateral came in the form of mints or tolls, his agents sat physically in the counting rooms to make sure the first coin of each day went to the firm. The message was blunt: systems beat slogans. Meanwhile, at home, the Fuggerai gave his city a visible dividend from private wealth. Modest brick houses with gardens, a parish church, a gate with curfew bells. The quarter looked like a tidy village tucked inside a bigger town. Tenants paid a token annual rent and pledged daily prayers for their founders. Critics called it piety wrapped in public relations. Supporters called it responsibility. Either way, the project outlived the arguments and the door is still open every morning. His entanglement with Rome deserves one more angle. The indulgence machinery that drew fire in 1517 had been designed, in part, to refinance existing debts on better terms while funding St. Peter's. Local bishops and their agents preached, parishioners gave, and trusted houses moved the money to Rome. The abuses that angered reformers' high-pressure sales, exaggerated promises flared on the preaching side, not in the transfer ledgers. But to the public, the distinction vanished. A banker's seal sat on the receipts of salvation. When Luther's theses flew, they stuck to that seal like pitch. The fallout reshaped his last years. Credit still flowed, but scrutiny hardened. Princes tried to play bankers against each other. Rivals agitated for a share in mines and mints. Cities looked for leverage in the new religious politics. Fugger responded with the same mix of patience and pressure: restructure here, enforce there, and keep the furnaces fed. Yet he knew the world was tilting. In letters he urged younger partners to protect the core mines, mints, transport, and to treat everything else as negotiable. He died in winter 1525, age 66, as peasant armies were being crushed on Swabian fields. He left no children. The firm passed to his nephew Anton, together with a ledger that, in almost every line, tied natural resources to sovereign power. Later generations would lose some monopolies and win others. They would endure wars and depressions and rebuild more than once. But the template remained: integration, information, and influence. What makes Jakob Fugger controversial is exactly what makes him consequential. He proved that in a fragmented continent, capital could be a political force independent of crowns. He pressed the church to clarify what counts as just gain versus sinful usury, helping to create lawful channels for risk and reward. He bound minds to mints and mints to monarchies. And he illustrated, more starkly than anyone of his century, the trade-off that shadows modern finance. Efficiency for some can mean pressure for others. The profits that funded chapels and housing also tightened the screws on debtors and towns. The credit that crowned emperors also escalated rivalries that later generations had to fight out on battlefields. Before we wrap, 3 takeaways tie the story together. First, information beats instinct. Fugger's private newsletters reported not only prices and harvests, but also troop movements, Ottoman advances, and papal elections. That stream of facts let him place bets that looked bold but were carefully hedged. Second, structure beats charisma. He codified practices so that any branch could pick up another's books and know exactly where cash, credit, and copper stood. Third, power begets power. Each concession from a mine, a mint, a toll, made the next negotiation easier because sovereigns who owed him yesterday needed him again tomorrow. That flywheel of capital and influence is why contemporaries called him, sometimes with awe and sometimes with anger, the richest man who ever lived. And yet the irony is that his daily life remained almost austere. Visitors described a man more interested in letters and ledgers than feasts, a merchant who could dine simply while commanding fleets of wagons and caravans of coin. He wasn't a saint. He squeezed hard when he thought it necessary and defended his monopolies with legal steel. But he also looked for durability, institutions, houses, and rules that would outlast him. In that sense, the most powerful man without a crown left something kings often couldn't: an operating system. We still live with parts of it today. If you've made it this far, drop a crown emoji in the comments so I know you reached the end. And if this saga hooked you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the fortunes and families that wrote Europe's playbook, starting with the Medici, whose story pairs perfectly with this one.